everybody, and welcome back. So, what if the real story behind every conflict, political, economic, energy decisions that were being made, what if it wasn't about ideology after all, but more about capital flows? Follow the money, right? We hear narratives all the time about climate, war. We hear about housing, inflation, central banking, stakeholder capital and participation. And behind all of that, there's always massive and massive amounts of money that is flowing in one direction to another. And someone is always seems to be positioned ahead of it. Just ask Nancy Pelosi. So today's guest has spent many, many years in the world of finance and has just recently gotten introduced to more of the details as a result of diving a little bit deeper with her research. And I'll tell you, if there's one person who can bring receipts for the statements that she makes, is this young lady that we were about to meet. And I'll tell you, it is well worth hearing from her. So we have CEO of Sandpiper Trading Corp, and she has been on the trading floors. She has been inside the commodity markets and, of course, CEO of Sandpiper Trading. And welcome, Jennifer Shaigec.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Nadine. Appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Did I get that last name pronounced properly?
You're close. It's Shaigec, like haggis with an S, but nobody ever gets it right.
Oh, well, hey, I've got a Scottish brother-in-law, so Haggis, Shaggis, I got it now.
There you go.
Wonderful. Well, you have some information that you want to share with us, and I was very fortunate. We just met recently, and to listen to one of your presentations on following the money trail, which I've been doing for a very long time. And I'll tell you, you brought some pretty powerful receipts to that conversation. And so today, really, what I want to do is really just give you the opportunity to share your message with my audience, and hopefully they can respond with some of their comments, some of their questions, and hopefully you can kind of shed some light on where things go. So if you're ready to go, my dear, then I think I'm just going to turn things over to you and maybe interject a couple of questions here and there, but really let you run the show.
Okay. Sounds good. Thank you. So I did work on an energy trading floor. It was for a marketing division of TransCanada Pipelines long time ago before I had my children. And then after my kids were grown, I started trading, had my own family fund that I've been running, and became really interested in mining stocks. And I love investing in silver and gold. And the last couple of years, gold in particular, has been really telling us a lot about the state of the world. And so my curiosity, like you said, got the better of me, and I started following the money trail to see why gold was rising like it was. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions that it had to do with the war in Ukraine and Russian sanctions, and that's not, in my opinion, the case. And I'd like to show a number of slides that I have that when you and I first met, I went over this via a Zoom call. And I think it's so important to get that information out there that, if anybody ever would like to have a Zoom with me or discuss it further, then they can reach out to me on my website, and I'm happy to give these group Zooms. Or I live in Calgary. I've talked to people about giving more presentations live here, because I just think that the times we're living in, it's such a critical discussion that people understand where we're headed, because I do think there's a lot of misconceptions about that. Central bank digital currencies, new global monetary system, all of that. So is it okay if I share my slides?
Absolutely. Bring it up and I'll move us over to so everybody can see.
Thanks. So you can see that one okay?
We certainly can. The evolution of money.
Okay, so one of my favorite quotes is that history was like a crystal ball, told us as much about the future as it did about the past. And I think in order for us to see where we're headed, we need to really look back at where we've been. And throughout history, the monetary system, the actual norm of that, was more of a hierarchy system, and imperial system, tribute based, like monarchies. And then in China, there were imperial dynasties for several centuries. And I think this is where we're headed. But that all came to an end in 1648 with the Treaty of Westphalia. So the end of the 30 Years' War. States kind of became sovereign. They had their own currency, their own laws, and that's when it really diverged from that hierarchy system. And then Henry Kissinger, I'm going to talk quite a bit about him, but he wrote a lot about this concert of Europe that existed from 1815 to World War I. And then the US hegemony really has been a fairly recent thing in our history, and really just a blip on the radar compared to how things have been in the past. But for me, this was quite a key thing, the name Marco Polo. So please remember that. But you can look on the left there. I have all the imperial dynasties in China. And there was this Italian explorer, Marco Polo, who was traveling the Silk Road. And in the 12th century, he came across China's Yuan dynasty, and that was the earliest fiat currency. And as fiat currencies usually do, it led to inflation and then it collapsed. But when Marco Polo discovered this, he was pretty excited about it. And he wrote a book on it and came back very excited, told Europe that they should adopt this amazing fiat currency. And at the time, it was in the 12th century, it was actually just, I believe it was birch bark, and it had the emperor's stamp on it. But yeah, he wrote about this to Europe, and it's interesting that this name will come up in a little bit, and you'll see why it's very important. But this is where I kind of think we're headed. So in 1907, there was a bank run, and it was called the Panic of 1907, very similar to 2007, 2009's great financial crisis, or global financial crisis. And a lot of people, like I said, compare the similarities to it, but I pulled this right off of the United States Federal Reserve website, both of these things. And so you can go and look at all of this information, but the meeting at Jekyll Island was key. So after that panic of 1907, there were a number of individuals that met in secret. And I pulled up who would be the equivalent in today's world. So imagine this, if these individuals and companies were meeting the Secret Six, and you didn't find out about this until 20, 25 years later, that they had been planning a new global monetary system. Now, back then it was the 1913 Federal Reserve Act, and it was on just a countrywide basis. But I think we're seeing the modern version of this globally. So this would have been the equivalent back then of today being Mark Carney, BlackRock, Jerome Powell, the IMF, Jamie Dimon, who's the head of JP Morgan, and then the CEO of Citigroup. So largest banks and financial institutions. It's really incredible when you think of it that way.
These are the world's biggest power brokers.
Exactly. Yeah. So what I was saying about this system being similar to the Federal Reserve when it was created in 1913, that was a hub and spoke system. And so the Federal Reserve is in Washington, governed out of Washington, but there are 12 different centers all over the country. And this to me is fairly obvious that, and I will get into this in more detail in a little bit, but if you go to the Financial Stability Board's website, they have these regional groups, and these, I believe, will be the spokes, and then the hub will be a global governing institution of some kind that I believe will be run by China. A lot of reason to believe that. Again, I'll get into that a little bit. But the key thing that happened recently that enabled this, because this will all be done via central bank digital currencies, was this ISO 20022 that recently was adopted. So I like to compare it to, if anybody's ever seen the movie Up, with the dog that has that dog collar, and every time he barks, it puts it into human language. This is kind of a global messaging system for financial transactions. And so in the past, if you did a transaction in a different currency, it used to, a while ago, it used to take, like, they would call it T+5, 5 days to settle. And then they shortened that time, T+2, T+1, because technology kept improving. But now this enables instantaneous settlement across the globe. And this is why you're seeing 24/7 trading now with the markets, because now we're able to do this without worrying about time zones. So the United States, there's a lot of talk about de-dollarization. And like I was saying, a lot of people think it had to do with the war in Ukraine and sanctions, or some people think it's been going on a little bit longer than that. I think mostly it started in 2008, around the time of the GFC. But if you look at these visuals, to me, they're quite striking because in 2008, 2009, central banks had been selling their gold for decades, and then they flipped and they became buyers of gold. You can see that really obvious there on the right. So what caused that? Well, the GFC was so severe that when the United States started printing more money, their debt became structural.
And now
And so at that point, it
GFC,
was,
she's referring to the global financial crisis, just so people
yes.
can follow along here.
So if you haven't seen the movie about it, Brad Pitt is in it. The Big Short. Highly recommend watching that. Kind of give you a better idea what that was about. I think mostly people that lived through finance or a little bit older probably remember it for the severity versus some younger folks. But so on the left, you can see that holdings of foreign holdings of U.S. debt peaked. Of U.S. Treasuries peaked in around that time as well, 2008, 2009. And then they started dumping those, and it's been on the decline ever since. But what was interesting to me is the middle one is I took that from an article in The Economist, that if we could see economic indicators that we were heading to war with China. And this was one of the graphics that they had in there. And so around that time, when that debt became structural, then it was basically inevitable that we'd be heading to a conflict with China, the United States would. And they started stockpiling a lot of commodities. And as I said, the article was about economic indicators that they'd be preparing for a war with China. And in the article, it mentioned that soybeans would kind of be a last indicator prior to conflict. And in the headlines, probably the last 2 months or so, it's been mentioned that China's been stockpiling quite a bit of soybeans, but you can see in the past they did that with a number of other commodities and food in particular. So those of us that are investing in the market, it's felt for some time, and I'm sure people just even their home finances, how you're feeling about, your groceries are unaffordable, things like that. It feels like we're really at a tipping point. And there's something called a Minsky moment, that all of these things have kind of led up to this speculative borrowing, like say Ponzi borrowing, decline in GDP, etc. All of the credit conditions, people are maxed out on their debt. And I pulled those stats off of FINRA right now, that margin accounts are at a record high. And you can see on the bottom right there, consumer credit is just unreal, the level of debt that both in the States and in Canada. And so I've been wondering, the Minsky moment usually comes when credit tightens and the banks stop lending. And as I said, it feels like we're a bit on the edge of a cliff. So what will tip us over? Well, I believe it's this. So there is something called the Basel Accords. For those that aren't familiar, there was the Basel Committee that was established in 1980 in Basel, Switzerland. And they came up with three different phases. There's likely a fourth and fifth that could be to come yet, but implementation of this third one is going to really damage the United States banks, the large banks, because what it does, it changes their internal risk models, and it changes the amount of capital and the quality of the capital that they're supposed to hold. And this was part of what really changed the trajectory of gold as well, because they made gold a tier one asset. And so it was higher quality capital. If you own crypto, Bitcoin, that's very important, because this Basel III gives that crypto a risk weight of 1,250%, which essentially bans it. And I find that a lot of people that are invested in crypto and Bitcoin, they don't really know the difference often between crypto and stablecoin and CBDCs. And that's really, really important that people familiarize themselves with that, because there's a lot of reason I think that by the fall, Bitcoin could be pretty much obsolete and crypto
Now,
because of these
Jennifer,
regulations.
yeah, I want to
Yep.
pause you there for a moment because I think there's a few things that we might just want to, and I know you're going to go further into depth of what we've already kind of scratched the surface on. But when governments, so when investors start dumping, to use your language, which is appropriate, treasuries,
Yeah.
there's usually a lack of confidence.
Correct.
Right. So we just
Mhm.
want to stress that, investors kind of to a certain extent, the money is kind of pushing the direction of decisions that get made. And it's the leading indicator oftentimes in sort of the bigger events that follow. And treasuries, because who's other than us, people who are in the world of finance following treasuries, it's rather boring for one.
Yes.
But it is a very good indicator when problems start to arise.
Mhm.
So just to clarify for people that, when Jennifer is talking about these things, like in as a financial manager, you're always looking at trends. You're always looking at, where has history repeated? What's been the outcome? Because it does. It may not always come out exactly the same, but it certainly comes out usually pretty similar. But can you talk a little bit about the Minsky report moment, and just maybe highlight what that was, what the Minsky and where that came from. And then, for those of you who were talking about 1913, when the Federal Reserve, there's a great book Edward Griffin did, and I'm sure you've read it, The Creature from Jekyll Island. And this really goes into a tremendous amount of detail as to how the system was structured. And the fact that you've drawn the parallel to 2008, 2009, and now we've gone from the United States on a national level to now basically we're trying to recreate that using CBDCs on a global scale. So if
Mhm.
you want to just, touch on those just a little tiny bit more with the Minsky moment, and then we'll jump right back into the your presentation again.
Okay. You might actually know more about that Minsky moment than I do, because that wasn't something I looked at in depth. I've given this presentation, gosh, yeah, it's normally called the Rhyme of History, and I've done three different versions now. And in prior ones, I've talked about the Buffett indicator and things like that that are a little more common, just overvaluation in the stock market, things like that. But the Minsky moment, when they talk about these extreme speculative markets. You can see the Ponzi borrowing, and I mentioned with margin accounts at record levels. It's really just that moment. It's named after an economist, and he came up with this concept that you can only really carry that so far, that people's credit gets maxed out, they can't pay their bills anymore, they default. And a lot of people, it's quite sad actually that to think 30% of Americans have their money in crypto right now, and it's just such a highly speculative environment. I think people are just desperate at this point to have that quick return because we just can't afford life anymore. And there's so many young people that have their money in this. But maxed out, I know people that are borrowing to buy Bitcoin. And so eventually we hit the wall there. There's something usually that will trigger that where the banks just say, we can't anymore. Sometimes there's bank failure, um, things like that, or defaults increasing, which we're starting to see the level of defaults in both countries increasing. And so when they tighten credit and then GDP starts to decline, the severity, I think, is the key with the Minsky moment versus some other ones that people might refer to. Is the severity is similar to that of the Great Depression. It's only happened a few times in history that the economy has crashed as bad as it has with a Minsky moment. Did you want to add anything to that, Nadine?
No, the only thing I would let people know that, so many people think that the Great Depression was created by capital markets, the private capital markets, in private industry, but it actually truly was a direct result, if you understand the history of that 1913 creation of the Federal Reserve. And it was a creation of the politics and the banking at the time, not something that, markets go up and down, but they're usually a little heartbeat, do. When the government and or the financial bankers get involved, we see crashes, booms, and busts, and that's where we've seen the most severe is after we have instituted these central banks, not prior. So, and these are just little things for people that if you have an interest. There's so much out there available as far as to read and to reaching out to, like you said, to yourself, that you could dig into to fully understand. For me, what I'm trying to really impress upon people is that, financiers, these big banks are not your friends. They're in it for their shareholders and for themselves. And when they create these crises, money never disappears, right? Money, I tell, is like energy. It just transfers. So if it's you've lost something, somebody else has gained something. So the question you need to be asking is, your loss is whose gain? Now, on that note, I'm going to put you back onto your presentation. I'm sorry to interrupt, but it's just
That's
so
okay.
nice to have somebody on, in the finance world who, we can share, different thoughts and ideas and, really just help educate more and more people to, where some of the problems lie. So you're now back on your presentation, and thank you so much.
Thank you. So that the Basel Accords that I was talking about, and we're on that Basel III right now. It's interesting to note, you can see there, Stop Basel Endgame. They only call it Basel Endgame in the United States. Every other country calls it that Basel III. And the United States is basically the last country to phase in these regulations. And it is up to Jerome Powell, chairman of the Federal Reserve, to take it through to that end, have it passed by these 3 or 4 regulatory levels in the United States. The public gets a chance to comment on it, and that's when that gets implemented. So just because it comes from the Bank for International Settlements, who is basically the central bank for central bankers across the globe, it cannot be implemented unless the country wants it done and the central bank of that country proceeds with it. And so the Bank for International Settlements has been that I took that quote directly from their website, just get it done. And they're getting quite frustrated that the United States hasn't done this, but it's no wonder because it will really damage the American economy, right down to the little guy. So I'm on Twitter. I have a little over 17,000 followers, I think. And a lot of those people are like Nadine and I in this financial circle. And you would think that they would know about the Basel Accords. But you can see I ran a little poll, and 57.6% said they know nothing. And this is just so important. And this was May 27, 2025. I ran that poll. But the fact that, like I said, these people are on the financial community and people aren't aware of it is quite concerning. But the Financial Services Committee, there were some Republicans that on December 19th, you can go to the website and read this press release that they put out. But this is what they talked about: is the United States economy is just so financialized compared to a lot of other ones that are, and they call it the real economy, based on manufacturing and things like that. But the United States is more about banking. And this is why this will damage them in particular. And I think this is the intention for a number of reasons, which I'm sure Nadine knows about too, but we'll get into that as well. But if you read that press release, and to me, it's always like a Friday news dump where they don't want people to see it. The fact that this came out just before Christmas and nobody was really paying attention to these press releases was sort of interesting to me. But the price of gold and silver, recently, they had a day or two where they tanked quite a bit. They dropped significantly. And that was the day that President Trump announced a new Fed chair nominee. So if Powell leaves and he is not able to implement this Basel III regulations that would damage the economy, now Trump is hoping that his new nominee, Kevin Warsh, will be able to prevent this from happening. And so I was quite curious who this Kevin Warsh gentleman is. I didn't know a lot about him, so I looked him up. And in November, he wrote this opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal. And I highlighted it on the bottom there in yellow, that he said, Basel Endgame isn't America's endgame. So clearly he obviously, as Fed chair nominee, would know the severity that this would impact the United States. And this is why Trump would like him to replace Powell, because hopefully he can prevent that from happening. But talking about history, so when I was saying it's like a crystal ball told us as much about the future as it did about the past. I've had people say to me that they think the United Nations is irrelevant, pretty much obsolete, and I can tell you that is not the case at all. I cringe when I hear people say that. But all of these institutions, IMF, World Bank, Bank for International Settlements, they're just so important. And I spoke at an investment conference in New Orleans in November, and I asked the crowd, there was probably 300 people, and I said, does anybody know who Kristalina Georgieva is? And I think maybe two in that crowd at an investment conference raised their hand. So this is the head of the IMF, and this is very important again that people need to be aware of this. I wish that the education system taught a lot more about these things because they're still very relevant today. But the Bank for International Settlements, it was formerly known as the Agent General for Reparations. So that was back 1930, following World War I. They were tasked with overseeing Germany's reparation payments following the war. And what I think is going to happen now is the IMF, UN, they're all talking about reparation payments on behalf of developed nations, fossil fuel producing nations, to basically make up for all the damage that we've done through climate change. So I think that the Bank for International Settlements, who's overseeing central bank digital currencies, is going to look after redistributing that wealth and the reparation payments. To me, it's pretty clear. But United Nations, I'll get into that as well, and you'll see why they are not obsolete and they're actually very, very frightening. But Nixon and Kissinger are key figures. And so in 1969, this is another thing I just want to, and I'll describe it a little bit more in detail coming up. But if people aren't familiar with the IMF's Special Drawing Rights, they really should go to the IMF's website and learn a little bit about them, because this is sort of the model for central bank digital currencies that I believe we're heading towards. So they were created in 1969, and they've kind of developed a little bit over time, but basically they're a basket of currencies. And I think we're going to see central bank digital currencies similar to that, but via those global corridors that I spoke about earlier.
Now, just to
So
highlight here for a moment too, special drawing rights, you'll often hear them referred as SDRs. So if people are reading and you're looking for special drawing rights, you don't see it, but you see SDR, that's indeed what you're looking at. And just before we move on, you keep talking about the reparations. Many people actually blame the Bank of International Settlements and the reparations and the severity of them for the rise of the Nazi regime, the government, and Hitler. So there's lots of stuff that you could go down that path too. But with respect to reparations, like who would, if let's talk about climate change for just a moment, who would you pay those to?
this is all, in my opinion, and you talked about me bringing the receipts. I hope I can show people why I think that's the case. But it's mostly going to, so they say, be redistributed wealth to poor nations like Africa, and they're already doing this. Just people are not aware of it. And what is really, really frustrating for me is when all these people in the financial community that don't know what these are, the fact that our government is putting billions annually into IMF's SDR system, and they're, I think, being funneled into very questionable places, not for the good of Canadians, that is for sure. And people don't even know they exist. But please go to the government's website and have a look and see, because under Justin Trudeau and Mark Carney, our contributions to the IMF's SDR quota has gone up over 413%. So that's quite something. Since 2015, they were pretty stable under Harper, didn't change. And now all of a sudden, Canadians are contributing way more to this pool and have no idea that these even exist. But I will go over that to show people where I think the money is going, because I do have a little bit of a background in forensic accounting, not anything in depth, but I find nobody really, aside from a few people, nobody really looks where this money is going. They don't go to the government website and see right to the end, and it's very, very concerning. So when I said this started back in 2008 with the whole de-dollarization, I think this plan, and I know this is very hard for people to believe, but again, like Nadine said, I try and bring the receipts, because this really started a very long time ago, but blatantly obvious when it came to Nixon and Kissinger's time in office. So I call them the global architects of all of this. So in 1969, as soon as Nixon got into office, one of the first things he did was relaxed economic controls on China. And if you've ever seen the movie The Killing Fields, about the rise of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, uh, they called this, Nixon and Kissinger called this Operation Menu. And it led to one of the most brutal genocides in the 20th century. It's horrific, the whole story. So they called it Operation Menu because they planned that over breakfast. They were having croissants and decided to name it Operation Menu, which to me is disgusting, very callous. A lot of Cambodians lost their lives. And then, like I said, the rise of the Khmer Rouge, one of the worst genocides in history. And they called this Operation Menu. So there's a lengthy list of things that they did that really handed China some very, very large strategic advantages. And that was one of them. And like I said, relaxing the economic controls, they withdrew troops from Vietnam, and eventually China filled that power vacuum there when that was reshaped. 1971, and here we go back to that Operation Marco Polo. So I mentioned earlier the Italian explorer that came across the fiat system in China's Silk Road, 12th century. So in 1971, Henry Kissinger was visiting Pakistan and said that he had a stomachache, and he hopped on a flight. He evaded reporters. He did not take White House translators with him. And he called this Operation Marco Polo, but he hopped on this flight out of Pakistan and went to Beijing secretly. Well, a month later, President Nixon closed the gold window, and that basically decoupled the dollar from being tied to gold, and they could just print money with abandon, and that's what led to the states um, losing purchasing power of their dollar, debt, etc. It was really a devastating moment for Americans, and they called it the shock for a reason. People had no idea that this was going to happen. But for me to make that connection, that Operation Marco Polo, which Kissinger obviously knew that fiat led to inflation and collapse in China. So for him to name it that is very telling. And then a month later, Nixon shock happens. And then later that year in 1971, China got Taiwan's UN seat. Taiwan, as the ROC versus the PRC, was a founding member at the UN, so they get permanent veto power. And so for them to get Taiwan's seat that year was quite telling as well. And then in 1972, Nixon visited China, and he called that the week that changed the world. And in my opinion, indeed it did. That was a huge event when he opened up trade to China, and a U.S. president hadn't been there in decades, and it's an enormous event, which we'll get into later. But Nixon and Kissinger, they went to great lengths to keep their mission secret. And Nixon actually passed an executive order that made much of their conversations with China structurally invisible. And you can see China at the UN kind of laughing. That picture to me was quite striking when they got Taiwan's seat at the UN. But this was really fascinating to me, because when Nixon campaigned, he never mentioned the environment, didn't come across as an environmentalist at all. And yet, when he took office, he created a bit of a hysteria for reform about the environment, and he became known as the most environmentalist US president ever. So he created the Environmental Protection Agency, the Clean Air Act. In 1973, it was the Endangered Species Act. And so if you hear things like TMX construction, being put off for a woodpecker's nest for 3 months, just for one single nest, but this is where it really started, was way back with Nixon's policies. But ironically, in 1974, he went to Saudi Arabia and made a deal with the Saudis for the petrodollar. So basically, the US financial system became entrenched in fossil fuels with that. So for a president that was such an environmentalist, it's a rather ironic twist. And I think we're seeing some parallels today with Mark Carney. So Henry Kissinger, I'm sure you heard Mark Carney's speech in Davos about a new world order. And this is where it came from, in my opinion. So that book on the left is Henry Kissinger's 1957 doctoral dissertation while he was at Harvard. And he wrote a book on China, and he wrote that one in 2014, World Order. And very much what we're hearing a lot of these elites or people like Mark Carney referring to that system today. And what was interesting to me is Henry Kissinger too. If you look on his Nobel Prize, you can read his biography there, and he was actually part of a psychological warfare program prior to getting into office with Nixon. And some of the things that it ties to, if you start looking into it, are how you can kind of brainwash a population. And it's a lot more powerful to get a population on side with a line of thinking than it is to try and actually work with just a couple of politicians that are in power. And so this is what I think they've done in the past with the climate change movement by creating that hysteria, is that they've got people to buy into that to the point where that and the things that are happening in the education system, it to me seems like a form of psychological warfare. It's just interesting when you start looking at their history there.
There
But
are
Kissinger talked,
so many psyops that we could go into, and I know you're trying to be
yes,
so careful with your words, but MK Ultra, these are all real things. People have been convinced and ill-informed or misinformed or deliberately misguided by media, politicians, history books, what they do and are taught in schools. But these are real things. Like MK Ultra is a real thing. It was a real operation. It was a real experiment that was done. And it cannot be underestimated, the findings and the effects of these things, because they're still being used, regretfully, on, I think, the public today unknowingly. And we're seeing impacts and effects, which is why having conversations like this with you. Henry Kissinger is probably the name that comes up behind every CIA scandal, every president, and a lot of the policies, as far as the architect, as you pointed out, of many and much of what we're seeing the outcomes of right now. So, every fiat system in the world collapses. Every single one, as it did in China, as it is done time and time again. It's just not a sustainable system. So they're always preparing for what the next system is going to look like. And I think both you and I agree that for the globalist, they are looking at the central digital banking for that. And I think this is where people need to get informed and become very concerned, because if we allow that to happen, you will find that we will be truly enslaved and captured in this digital cage where you cannot get out.
absolutely. The first time I gave this presentation, and I still keep the same title for it, I had New World Order. And it was a little over a year ago, and somebody said to me that sounded so conspiratorial. Are you sure you want to use that in the title? But now, look at it, you're hearing it all the time, and this is where it came from. So it's
Mark
worth looking
Carney
at.
just spoke it to the
Yes,
world, so it's
exactly.
and then
Yeah.
CBC proceeded to change that.
my gosh. Yes, yeah. Yeah, it's shocking. Just even if people don't want to spend the time reading, or I don't even, I refuse to buy Henry Kissinger's books and support him, but just put it into Chat GPT because it's really quite fascinating. Even if you just run the parallels with Mark Carney's speech in Davos, what it comes up with. But it's very frustrating to me. Because Nadine, you and I talked about this just briefly before. When you mention the name Rockefeller, people automatically think that you're wearing a tinfoil hat. And they look at you, like you have two heads. But this is why I really want to bring the facts to people. And I'll talk about Vivian Krause in a minute. She did some phenomenal work. She's kind of my hero. Um, I've been trying to do a lot of what she left off with, but I love to read the New York Times from decades ago because there's tons of information in there about the history of the Rockefellers and Kissinger. And I also love to read on the American government's website, the Office of the Historian, and you can actually read transcripts of their conversations from back then that were released. And so a certain amount of time has to go by before they actually put those on the site. So I think you can only maybe get up to Reagan now at this point, but it's very fascinating to read some of what these two and their admin discussed. But even prior to Nixon getting into office, a lot of things were done that were very interesting. So Rockefellers gave Kissinger, that was Nelson Rockefeller, he gave Kissinger $50,000. You can see the articles from New York Times, 1974. Just before, this was actually in 1969, that Rockefeller gifted this to Kissinger before he went into office with President Nixon. And it didn't come out until 1974. But you can see there, they enjoyed close ties for a very long time, Nixon and Kissinger and the Rockefellers. And I love that quote from President Nixon. I was watching an interview with him in 1983. And he said Henry Kissinger thought history would rate him as a great president, but he said it depends who writes that history, because everyone back then, they were obsessed with Watergate, but historians, maybe 50 years from now, so this is 1983, so we're looking at 2023, about now, I would hope that they'd see it in a different perspective. And he says, I'm the president that opened relations with China. And Henry Kissinger, he visited China more than 100 times in his life. And when he passed, China mourned the loss, the entire nation, of their most valued old friend. So China was quite devastated with the loss of Kissinger, and no wonder they called him a valued old friend. And this to me was very interesting. So I pulled this directly from the CIA. You can see same thing with the Office of the Historian. They will release some documents as time goes by. But the Rockefellers, they made a lot of their fortune in China, selling kerosene to the Chinese. And a lot of people think they made their money off of Standard Oil, which obviously they did, but a lot of that was done in China over a century ago. And so, as I said, this is directly from the CIA's website, and the one with Mandarin there, that was actually, I took that from the Rockefellers website, and they've had a close relationship with China for a very long time. And these are really fascinating things to read. Like I said, if you want to go to the CIA's website, you can access this. It's not hard to do. But they talk about all of this. The Rockefellers had this tight relationship with China. So this is what we're seeing now, that I'll get into Vivian Krause's work in a moment, but she tracked a lot of things back to the Rockefellers. So this Rockefeller Catalytic Capital, they have something called the Bretton Woods Initiative at 80. And if you look what I've highlighted in yellow at the bottom, they talk about a reimagined vision for the financial system. And with a focus on rectifying existing power imbalances in the current system. And that's that reparation payments, redistributive financing that we were talking about earlier. But they talk about a more equitable international financial architecture of the future. But the key there is at the top, that they talk about financially empowering the global south, and that's China. So talking about the IMF, the World Bank, it's all highlighted there. And you can go to this catalytic capital. If you Google this Bretton Woods initiative, it's all there. But this is who they've been working with for a very long time. And when you see Trump, I've had people say to me, "Oh, Trump's just going after higher education when he is suing Harvard and is, defunding Harvard." Well, no, there's actually a long history with the Rockefellers and Kissinger at Harvard. And guess what? Mark Carney went there, was in some very influential roles at the university. Mark Carney's daughter now goes to Harvard. And I know it's a big school, but when you start seeing some of the roles that these people have played there, it becomes a little more obvious that there's more to it than just being a Harvard alum. But the Chinese Communist Party themselves, they call it their party school. They've trained so many Chinese Communist Party officials there that, yeah, Harvard is referred to as their party school. So that picture on the left there, that I took that article from the Harvard Crimson themselves, and same articles on the right, and they talk about this stories of Kissinger, Rockefeller, larger forces they were a part of, that they all go back to Harvard. Mark Carney's daughter is currently attending Harvard, but they actually had a Henry Kissinger professorship. That Henry Kissinger, to some, is a polarizing individual. Not everybody. He has that Nobel Peace Prize. Some people think he's great. No, not in my opinion. But the professor that ended up getting this Kissinger award, basically, it's I need my glasses on to see that, sorry. But yeah, it's Jake Sullivan, national security advisor for Biden when Biden was vice president in the Obama administration. But the title of it I thought was really interesting because, yeah, professor of the practice of statecraft and world order. So there we go again with world order. And it's interesting to see that the same circles of these people are involved with Harvard and these types of things. But what's fascinating, probably to me, the most important detail that I think people should be aware of is in 1949, the Rockefellers donated the land where the United Nations is in New York. And that is considered international territory. It does not belong to the United States.
Nope.
And so anybody in a role there, an official or a diplomat, they receive immunity for acts that are performed in that official capacity, diplomatic immunity. So you look at Mark Carney, Special Envoy, Climate Action and Finance at the UN. Anybody that has done something like money laundering, for example, through their role at the UN, they would be granted diplomatic immunity for that. So interesting that the Rockefellers donated that land, and that this would be, the case, that people wouldn't necessarily be prosecuted for their crimes.
Well, you don't want to have
But
to leave, too far from home to commit crimes against your own country.
yeah, yeah,
You just want to be able to walk down the street, Jennifer.
yeah, yeah. But so, people might think, well, why the Rockefellers? Why now? That was a big question for me, is why now is all this happening? So this article was quite fascinating. New York Times, 1992. The Rockefeller family tries to keep a vast fortune from dissipating. What they mentioned in that article was that they had this trust for the family fortune from 1934, and that trust ends when this fourth generation of Rockefellers passes. And we're on the last, I don't even know if they've all passed now. I think we're on the last one or two. But when that fifth generation, that trust expires and they don't have the advantage of that anymore, it's going to change a lot of things for the family's fortune. And so they had to come up with some new strategies. And there's, in that article from the New York Times, David Rockefeller talks about exactly that. They had to come up with some new plans to prevent that from happening because they wanted to keep all of their wealth. So what did they do? A lot of things, but one of them, in my opinion, is working through the IMF. And when I talked about de-dollarization before, people dumping those US Treasuries, this is key. A lot of things that were done through the IMF, this report in particular. So it's called The Silent Revolution, the International Monetary Fund, 1979 to 1989. And that report came out in 2001. But this comment, that was in that document. And Basically, it says they don't have to report anything to us. That to make these documents available to a wider audience could create economic and political problems for the authorities and could compromise their willingness to be forthright. There should be no publication of information on individual countries. And this is a common theme with a lot of the IMFs. I'm sure nobody I know besides myself really goes and reads these things on the IMF website. But there's a lot that they don't tell us, and they claim they don't have to, but that's still our taxpayer dollars going to all of these things. Very frustrating. So one of the things here, I pulled that quote again from this, IMF's transparency policy allows for the deletion of the authorities' policy intentions. And so they don't have to tell you what the intentions of these things are. But this to me was quite fascinating because Mark Carney, if you go back and read a lot of his speeches as a central banker, they're very telling. And he called for the creation of these off-balance sheet trusts through the IMF. And it's basically a form of swapping out US dollars, US treasuries, reducing other countries' exposure to it via these off-balance sheet trusts. And so when they're off-balance sheet, the IMF, again, doesn't have to tell you very many details at all. But one key thing is they are not subjected to United States veto power because the US has the most quotas. I think it's 16.5%. And so they can veto things at the IMF, but they cannot when they're off balance sheet trusts. And so they're named things like resilience and sustainability, poverty reduction, all of that, all these climate things that we're seeing. And people don't know they exist. Again, your taxpayer dollars are all going to this and nobody knows about them. But what was fascinating to me, I said I like to read these Office of the Historian documents. Kissinger in 1974. I thought it was Carney, but it was actually Kissinger that came up with the idea of these. And then they weren't really created for this purpose until more recently.
Well, what's interesting as well is Mark Carney is now trying to put legislation through in Canada with respect to ministers not having to disclose information as well and exempting private interests from criminal they can't be criminally charged, for example. So, none of these ideas are really new. And for our audience, like trusts, you often hear, oh, people have a family trust. This is a way people protect their wealth when you have wealth to protect. This is not something you do when you have, $500,000 or $1 million in your RRSP. This is stuff that, truly wealthy families, but they have the means, the resources, the accountants, the lawyers. RBC got caught, doing some, questionable things for some wealthy families offshore. And, they know the rules. They know how to play the game. And this is what's truly scary about Mark Carney is everybody's like, oh, they love his resume. All the liberals got caught up and he's a banker and he can handle Trump. I'm like, yeah, this is not Justin Trudeau. This is a sophisticated individual who's been groomed through the system, who knows how the game is played. And that's the scary part. He knows the rules and where they can be bent, where they can be ignored, and or where they can just simply be broken altogether. So, these are the concerns I had with Mark Carney and voiced them long before he got elected. And I could see where things were going with, Justin Trudeau. And I knew, and I've got it on video. That's the one thing with YouTube. You can't take it back, right? When you put it out there, it's out there. And, these are the problems and you're seeing it all materialize. But again, history repeats, or at least sounds very similar.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Yeah. And I've looked at these fairly closely, and a lot of it you hit a dead end. And if anybody can prove me wrong, I would love to be proven wrong because this is very upsetting when you see where all of this is headed. But nobody looks at these things, and now is the time for people to be vocal about this and fight it before it's too late, because I think in short order it will be too late, and I'll explain why that's the case. But just for the SDRs, when I talked about the off-balance sheet trusts, so this is kind of how it's done. You have to be on this list of 20 prescribed holders, and they're all pretty much these development banks, a lot of African ones for poorer countries there, Arab Monetary Fund, Asian Development Bank, all of that. And you can see Bank for International Settlements is on there. So this is all where they can do this exchanging of US dollars, US treasuries for SDRs, for gold, for these currencies. And nobody is aware, but it's your taxpayer dollars. So you can see in the middle, the voluntary trading agreements. Canada is on that list and China. So there's all this swapping that is done and nobody knows. And it's a lot of it is done through supposed loans to poorer countries. And I'll show you in a second where one of them in particular went that was very upsetting. But yeah, you can see on the right, they talk about supporting these poor countries. And this is what they're claiming it's for. But is it really going there? Well, this is the one I chose to zero in on because just the title alone was really upsetting. So $8.2 million for gender just low carbon rice value chains in Vietnam. Now, again, anybody can prove me wrong here, but I'll show you the dead end that I hit when I tried my best to follow the money. So this 8.2 million, that was just that small amount out of Justin Trudeau's climate finance fund for $2.65 billion just over 5 years. That's your taxpayer dollars. So this 8.2 million went to Oxfam, who was partnered with this CSR Asia. And I wanted to see how 8.2 million of our taxpayer dollars, they're creating gender just low carbon rice value chains in Vietnam. But I hit a dead end because that partner, CSR Asia, who is located, as you can see there, in China, not in Vietnam, not in Canada. Yeah, it hit a dead end in China. So basically disappeared into a black hole because CSR Asia was delisted and expelled for failure to communicate progress. Now, if you follow that trail, I haven't included it here, but I've looked at it again, and I see this all the time on the stock market with companies I would never invest in. Is they'll pivot to another commodity, they'll rename themselves, and this is what happened here: is that they were delisted and then they came back with another name, and since that actually have been acquired and renamed again. So it's very interesting when people actually start following the money to see where this has gone. But yes, black hole in China, all while Canadians are lined up in record numbers at food banks across the country. So I've made the joke, I hope at least, they can get a box of gender just rice, because to me, it's very, very upsetting to see our country headed this way. But Vivian Krause, as I said, she's kind of my hero. So she started doing this a little while ago, tracing the money, wrote about it in the Financial Post. And I just am flabbergasted that Canadians do not know her name. It should be a household name. My sister in Ontario, never heard of Vivian. And even my brother here in Alberta, I'm like, guys, you have to learn about what Vivian uncovered because it's unreal. So I pulled this out of one of those articles. For 30 years, Rockefeller Brothers has led the global warming movement, funding more than 200 organizations in the US and around the world. So please, everybody, if you're listening to this, take the time and read the Alberta inquiry into Vivian's work, because they had Deloitte audit her work and they came back and said, boy, Vivian was really onto something, but you know what? She basically hit the tip of the iceberg. And it's horrible when you start seeing all the things that they have funded and prevented development of pipelines, all kinds of mining projects. They're preventing this from happening. And Vivian, thankfully, opened that box. Please read her work, read the inquiry, because in it says all Albertans and Canadians should be aware. And nobody, hardly anybody I've talked to, unless they're kind of in the energy industry, has heard about this. And we really need to be aware of these things and read what's on the government site. But what's really upsetting to me, you can see in 2020, so it was the Rockefellers did a lot of this work behind Tides Canada. And they rebranded. They called Vivian's work in that inquiry a smear campaign. And now they're called Make Way. And they're basically doing a lot of the same tricks all over again with your taxpayer dollars and preventing development, there are things that I suspect that I'm not sure if I want to say, but following the money, it's pretty obvious to me that money that's supposed to be for good causes, not going there. So please be aware of that, because I think we're headed for nationalization too of a lot of our resources under the guise of Indigenous conservation, Indigenous ownership. I don't believe that's actually the case where it's going. But what was interesting, so Rockefeller's tides Canada has now become this make way, and they have this document that you can find on the internet recently. Um, they talk about how Indigenous groups can get grants from the government, the process, and how to protest all of this development. It's basically a guide to everything that's been happening. But I took that page out of there. It's pretty upsetting how they vilify the settlers and what we did to their land. And this is where all these land acknowledgements and things are coming from. It's the Rockefellers' work, honestly. But yes, I highly recommend that people read some of Makeway's publications, and you'll see where all this is coming from.
Well, I think
Now,
this is a really important part, because how you're talking about nationalizing some of these things, our natural resources. That's if Carney hasn't outright sold them. Because if you understand what's going on, like China does own mines, it does own areas of natural resources, and they have the ability to protect with their own security, their own people, those resources. So, it's one thing if we were to nationalize it, at least it would still be some benefit potentially to Canadians. But the what you're seeing in BC with UNDRIP, and what you saw with the provincial government and what they did there with DRIPA. Much to your point, I think it is much easier for governments or individuals or special interests or private interests like the Rockefellers to influence and control a small group of Indigenous people than it is the masses. So there is a lot more going on that needs to be unpacked, I think, around Indigenous population and groups. Then is being disclosed or being openly discussed. And of course, you get called a racist the minute you bring out that you want to have this conversation. And it's not about racism. It's not about white privilege. It's not about even the Indigenous populations. A lot of them don't even know what's going on themselves. There's being deals made in back rooms for many of them. There's a whole Aboriginal industry of which the majority of Indigenous populations never see a dollar of. Some of the chiefs get a little handout maybe, and maybe some of the upper echelon, but the individual people living on those reserves see nothing. They're still living in abject poverty, still, massive problems with drug use, because they really have no hope, right? One of the things I also want to point out before you continue on here was when I was doing the Alberta Pension Plan tour, one of the things I used to bring people's attention to was a company called Trust Bridge Partners, because people are so adamant that the CPP is this well-run, well-administered, honest, independent, and you're shaking your head already because I know you know, entity from the government, and they think that it is theirs. And it's like, no, it is a government asset, sits on the government books. And you want to talk about Ponzi schemes? It is the largest Ponzi scheme that has ever been perpetrated on, I think, a nation. And that you can quote me on that. Trust Bridge Partners. I always tell people, if nothing else, take 5 seconds, type that name, trustbridgepartners.com, put that into your Google search. And you know what it comes up with? This little blue screen that says info@trustbridgepartners.com. That's it. Nothing else, nothing more. $600 million. And I'll tell you this, I don't know if you're aware of this, but Mark Meshin, who was the president and CEO of the Canada Pension Plan at the time, guess whose money this went to? Canada Pension Plan. And went to who? It went to a director of the CPP, and it went to Mark Meshin's wife. So you want to talk about conflicts of interest? I'm happy to name names because it's right there. All you got to do is take 10 seconds to Google it. You'll see it. And $600 million. And the majority of these investments were supposed to be spent where? In China. And guess what? When you go on to CPP and you try to track them down to follow them through, they don't follow the mandate that it stated, if you can find it at all. So it's, people want to talk about, the government. And then, like here in Alberta right now, as you know, Jennifer, we're having a little conversation about Alberta independence, and the pension plan is a very hot topic because you have a lot of boomers right now who are like, don't mess with my pension. And it's like, you have no idea how abused and misused your pensions actually, and there's nothing there. It has an unfunded liability of about $1.4 trillion, 700 billion in assets, meaning that if you were to cash that in tomorrow, there is nothing.
Mhm.
So anyway, I just wanted to throw that out there because there's, a little bit relevant to what's going on today. And of course, it's not Rockefeller's, but
Mhm.
it's happening in so many different places. It's systemic. We have a systemic problem across Canada with pretty much every institution that the government has been using. They're captured, in my opinion, and being used against the benefits and the best interests of the public for private or special interest groups. So sorry again, I interjected, but
Nope,
hopefully for
that's
some
okay.
people they found that interesting, and I'll let you continue on.
Thank you. So, what's interesting to me too, I think that, you know, people are very anti-Trump, and I'm not a Trump fan myself as a person. I'll be honest, when Biden won last time, I actually cried tears of joy because I thought that, Trump was horrible. But now I'm seeing what he's doing and why. When you follow the money, it's shocking to see that he's doing a lot of the right things. But this one in particular was fascinating to me because I invest in metals, like I said, and more recently with the precious metals, silver and gold. But for a long time, I've been heavily invested in copper. Copper's in everything that we use. It's the critical metal, and we're facing a serious shortage of it in the future. So this was fascinating. Like I said, I own some shares in an exploration company that is not far from this area, and that's why this one became of interest to me. But the bottom circle there, that's the area of one called the Resolution Copper Deposit, and that is a joint venture between two of the world's largest mining companies, BHP and Rio Tinto. They have been fighting in the court system, Supreme Court, for, oh gosh, over 20 years. They've spent over $2 billion trying to get this into production. But Indigenous groups in the area have, with the backing of the United Nations, managed to lock this deposit in, and it is not being developed. Now, if it were developed, it would supply 25% of the United States' annual copper needs. One of the largest deposits in the world. The United States desperately needs this. So why is it being blocked? Well, I talked to the CEO of the company that I own that's not far from here, and he was actually he's an older gentleman. He was behind the discovery of this Resolution copper deposit. And he has said, it's crazy. When I drove out there 2 decades plus ago, there wasn't a TP in sight, and there was no talk of sacred land and protecting this. This is a very recent thing. And if you look, well, who is donating millions of dollars for things like Indigenous health programs to these First Nations groups around there? So when you see damage being done domestically in the United States, that's what I'd like people to understand too, is this is not just a Canadian thing, and this is why Trump is fighting this now. Because the Rockefellers, in my opinion, have been working very closely with China. And in the past, what was interesting in the case of Resolution Copper is that Nixon quietly amended a law regarding the land area in that national park there, basically letting the government have subsurface rights for the mining there, and it couldn't be unlocked for decades. And then President Obama did that land transfer more recently. So it's just interesting when you start seeing what's going on there. And like I said, I think it's, it's not just a Canadian thing. This is a China Rockefeller thing to a large extent, that they've been able to block these resources. I think we're headed towards conflict with China, and that eventually they hope to have ownership of all of this. Now, Rio Tinto, when I said it's a BHP Rio Tinto joint venture, Rio Tinto actually has quite a large portion of it is Chinese owned, and
Owned.
they have not had to guarantee that that copper would be used in the United States. They can ship it all to China from that deposit if they want. So that may just happen. But 2024, this was a headline on CBC that led me to this, and I was quite shocked because I don't think many people paid attention. I try not to read CBC, to be honest, but I was doing some research into another mining company in the north, and I noticed in 2024, Justin Trudeau made the largest land transfer in Canadian history in this devolution agreement. And start looking into that. I think we're going to see a lot more of that in the future, these land transfers to Indigenous groups. Is it really going to Indigenous groups? That is the question. When you start reading about where the money actually goes, it's very doubtful how much of this actually reaches them. But back in 2016, there was a lawsuit. The settlement out of court, federal government settled with the Inuit population there, the NTI, 255.5 million out of court settlement. So that's your taxpayer dollars that you didn't even really know about. And who it went to, they couldn't even be reached to clarify how directors would be compensated for their work on this board, what they would use the money for, and when it would all be doled out. And this is what I find with a lot of these government programs. When you look about funding for First Nations, they have to apply for a lot of these things, and it never says if they got it, where the money went, what it was really used for. It's very vague wording. And if you want to submit a request, now you have to actually contact the Indigenous people for that information. And apparently, according to the government, they are not obligated to provide you with any details where that money went. When you see how many, like I said, billions of taxpayer dollars are going to this, and it's like Nadine mentioned earlier about that one, when you're trying to look up information, this Nunavut trust, that money that was supposed to be put into this trust. Well, it's this gentleman in Ottawa that is heading it up. I looked at his LinkedIn, it says he's present, still there, but the website for it is not in existence. And I tried several and hit a dead end. So again, somebody in Ottawa is managing this fund, and there is no accountability to taxpayers whatsoever where this is going. Dead end. Website is down. And we were talking about nationalization. One of my concerns living in Alberta has been an NEP 2.0. And so I've done some research into if we could be seeing that again and how it would, history doesn't repeat, but it definitely rhymes. And I'm seeing a lot of the same things now. And what we need to watch for is an escalation in the language that is used. Because the NEP, a lot of people in Alberta afterwards said we should have seen this coming, because really the government made it clear. They talked about it for a few years prior, just not really in ways that people necessarily recognized until after the fact. Sorry for this slide. I was hoping to have it a little more organized for you before I kind of rushed to add some of this, because there's so many things I just don't want to leave out. But you can go to the Liberals website and see this for yourself. And, they've really tried to strike this emotional chord with us to get behind kind of the anti-American stance and become more about nationalizing things. And so a lot of these bills that we're seeing passed, talking about projects of national interest and them having the ability to just go ahead and do things because it's in the national interest. It's actually really concerning and very similar to how the NEP was done. And what happened back then is they waited for this crisis moment where they kind of slowly prepared the population that, we might have to do this. They got people more worked up about it. And then when the energy crisis hit, it led to a lot of things that they could just say it's in the national interest. We need to do this. Very much the case, the same language escalation that we're seeing now. And I talked before about Nixon. Not, he became this environmentalist all of a sudden, and then he went and signed a deal with the Saudis for the petrodollar. Very similar here. Mark Carney, he wrote the book on values. He's been talking about sustainability and the environment for a very long time. But then he gets in office and starts making deals with one of the world's largest polluters, and then makes a deal with Qatar as well for investment in Canadian energy projects. Not exactly the peak there of climate examples. So it's just disgusting to me. But one of the things Carney said in the past, he was speaking at a CNBC's Sustainable Future Forum. And this is what, in hindsight, I think we can all see what's coming now if you read his words. But he talked about it being essential to retool the plumbing of financial markets so that every financial decision can take climate change into account. And this is what I'm very much seeing with the CBDC technology that they're implementing. The goal is for 2027 to have a lot of this up and running, and they'll be able to take your money. You're not going to really have your bank account with your money in it anymore. It is government money with a CBDC, and they can control everything with that, including if you want to buy meat more than twice a week, they can put a limit on that.
And one of the things too here with Mark Carney was, I'm sure you're familiar with GFANS, which was started when he was, working. And what they did with GFANS, as well as when he was trying, when he was the governor, both in England in particular, but then with GFANS, which was a Scottish initiative, is they were using the banking institutions and through, I wouldn't say coercion, but through some very strongly worded, agreements, he was pushing them to defund particular projects, especially around energy, oil and gas, traditional, energy. So, he understands the game, right? And he knows which buttons to push and where he can go. If he's not getting his way one way, he'll go another direction and get it somewhere else. So, I always tell people too, Carney is incredibly swift when it comes to knowing where to go when and how, and if he gets blocked one direction, he knows the angles to kind of work through on another. So the CBDCs, to your point, 2027 is coming very quickly. Very quickly. We do not have a lot of time. And I love right now how so many people are still defending Mark Carney. And yet Mark Carney just literally a year ago said China was our greatest threat, is now saying that we have cultural similarities and how we need to better align. And we're cozying up. When he released the budget and he talked about international or generational investment, he wasn't talking about investments. Investments require risk, and it often requires, capital to be injected, but you're getting a return on that investment. Selling a natural resource is not an investment. He's selling Canada out. That's where our wealth resides, in our natural resources in the ground. And he is selling those, not to set up manufacturing to produce a product where we will see a return on that. He's seeing a short-term windfall through a sale, only to lose our long-term, truly the investment portion of that and where the return lies. And again, this is where, again, he knows the words to use and how to manipulate them, because people don't understand. And then they're told, the economy is too complex and money's too complex for you to get involved, when it's really not. If you sell your car, if you use that car to make your living and you sell it, sure, you get a windfall, but eventually that runs out. And then you've sold the one asset you have that could produce you an income for generations and generations. That's the investing part. And we're not doing investing in Canada. We are literally, in my opinion, just selling natural resources to the highest bidder. And in this case, we're not even putting it out to the highest bidder. We are selling it out to the greatest polluters, but the people who need it. And then you're seeing him drive this wedge between Canada and the United States. The United States knows and is preparing, in my opinion, for conflict with China, who obviously supply chains, natural resources. And Trump is trying to cut that off. And what's Canada doing? Opening up the gates, opening up the door. And that's not going to end well, unfortunately, for Canadians.
Mhm. It's upsetting, like I was talking about in hindsight, when you see how all of our natural resources, a lot of them have been basically locked in and waiting for China. And that's what we're seeing now when they talk about shipping all of our energy to Asia, that's so important. This, in hindsight, it was so clear that this was the case all along. And Carney, you know, please read his speeches as a central banker, because for 20 years, he's been calling for China to have the new global reserve currency. All kinds of things that favored China, just like Nixon and Kissinger did back then. Carney has been calling for this for a very long time. And so when Trump is, coming at Canada, I think Nadine, you said you interviewed Sam Cooper the other day, and he looks at different things than I do, but it's so important that people are awake to what's happening and why the United States would actually have good reason to view us as a national security threat on their border.
Well,
Totally
we've
understandable.
already been excluded from the Five Eyes. We've been excluded from, what I would deem to be, very significant conversations. Mark Carney has rejected the peace, that Trump has put forward. $1 billion. Realistically, I mean, looking at what Canada's been spending these days, what's $1 billion to be a part of it? Oh, well, we'll have to consider that because it doesn't align with Mark Carney's objectives, and the global new world order objective, in my opinion. And thank you so much for exposing so much of this today, because we're seeing it here in your presentation again, where the alignment lies. And I mean, the people have to understand, if we 80% of our trade, I think it's 76% actually, um, is with the United States. And we're completely abandoning that relationship over tariffs, a conversation about tariffs, in which case Canada has tariffs on the United States and has long, in my opinion, abused that system. Our whole dairy, milk, cheese cartel that we have in Canada, that supply, that should have left a long time ago, right? That is definitely not a fair exchange as far as you want to talk about trade. And yet nobody wants to have that conversation. Everybody's looking to point the finger and blame Trump. But nobody's actually taking the time to step back and understand what the long-term consequences of our cozying up to China actually are. And I'm not talking about the Chinese people either. I spent 3-4 months in China in 2004. I was so impressed with the people there. Just beautiful, beautiful people. But you got to separate politics from the people. And that's like Ukraine. You have to separate the politics and the politicians and the corruption that's going on there from the actual people who are suffering under that regime. And so, and that's hard for people to do, to get that logical, bring the receipts, vice the emotional sentiments that go with it. And for those listening who are Alberta separatists, of which I am one, I think Alberta needs to get away from Canada. It is moving in a bad direction. And I think the more distance we can put between us and Canada right now, absolutely the better. On that note, I'll put you back onto your presentation here and continue on to enlighten us.
Thank you. I wasn't sure how long you wanted to chat for because I cut a lot out. I could go on for hours about this. The one thing when we were talking about 2027, there's something called the Davidson window. There were, it started in 2021. There was a Admiral Phil Davidson testified before the Armed Services Committee in the United States, and he talked about conflict with China in 2027, and they called that the Davidson window. So if you Google that, you can see he wasn't alone in the US military way back 2021. He started talking about why this was all aligning for 2027. And I believe a lot of it has to do with the monetary changes that we're seeing happening that they want to implement for 2027. So it's all kind of coming to a head. And this is why the price of gold and silver have really been going up. But when you read that national security strategy that Trump's admin put out in November 2025, now in light, I just can't get enough of this now that I, have looked at all of this. Reading it now, knowing what I know about the Rockefellers and things like that, it really puts it in a new light. You can see that the one second from the bottom there. American elites over 4 successive administrations of both political parties were either willing enablers of China's strategy or in denial. That tells you a lot right there, that this was within the American government, just like it is within our government right now. And I can tell you, Mark Carney is not in denial. He's a willing enabler, very much so.
Absolutely. There's no doubt about that.
Mhm. So I'm just really encouraging people to start, please open your eyes. If you haven't seen this information before, again, feel free to reach out to me. But when you view it in this light, and you can see the climate change comment there on the right, we reject the disastrous climate change and net zero ideologies that have so greatly harmed Europe, threaten the United States, and subsidize our adversaries. And he is so right in saying that, because this money is not going where it's supposed to be going. If you think it's making a cleaner planet and helping Indigenous people, I really don't think so. But what Nadine said is true. I'm very fond of Chinese people. I haven't been to China. My ex-husband traveled there a lot for business, and I have friends that have been there, and they said it's a lovely country. It's amazing. The technology that they have there, how well people are doing, how clean it is. But do you really want to live in, with a communist government? Look at things like their digital currency that they have, and how they use the social credit system. And, they're not going to treat even Canadians anywhere near as good as they treat their own Chinese people. So know what we could be headed for, because I really believe we're in serious danger. But President Xi, he thinks that, this is the conclusion of history, that China is once again going to become the center empire. And they have a lot of these initiatives underway, this global development initiative, security, civilization. But the key there is global governance. And they're very close to doing that. They own resources all across the world, ports, things like that they control. This is the final step here, where if they, were governing CBDCs, and this to me was really key as well. So the UN came out with this new UN tax convention, and increased global tax rates, and they want to be in charge of this globally to create a fairer global tax system to address imbalances favoring us, the developed nations, focusing on digital services taxation, dispute resolution, and resource-rich countries' rights. And then on the bottom left there, the IMF, they continually talk about this redistribution, inequality, and growth. So what they did is they created something called Bridicom, which is, you can go to that website, bridicom.org, and it's basically a digital tax collection agency. Globally, they will be able to do this. You look at a lot of these things from the UN. They talk about changing this financial architecture, and how, look at time for a more ambitious redistribution and reparations agenda. It's all over what they're planning to do. And if you think it's far-fetched, I can tell you it's not. It's very frightening, because all of that technology, go back to that ISO 20022 that I spoke about at the beginning, and the programs that they have with the Bank for International Settlements, we are just this close to having CBDCs where they can just take your money. And you can see Digital Currency Global Initiative. This is part of the UN Sustainable Development Goals that Justin Trudeau, Mark Carney are so big on. Digital Currency Global Initiative. They're saying all of this out loud. And it's time that we pay attention, because this is happening. It's not a conspiracy theory. And this is why Donald Trump, when he came into office, one of the first things he did was prohibit CBDCs from being established in the United States. They're going with stable coins. And again, we all need to know the difference. Stable coins are not CBDCs,
No.
but that would mean that the United States would not be subjected to this global tax initiative and the redistribution and all of that. They want to avoid that. So that's why they're one of the only countries not doing that. And this is why Trump has withdrawn from a lot of these agreements. And, people think, oh my goodness, America's supposed to lead. They should be sticking with the WHO and the United Nations. This is all part of it. And there was an interesting speech from the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent. I think this was back in October. I have the little white box down at the bottom. And he talked about Mark Carney's creation of that off balance sheet trust in that speech. And he said the IMF and the World Bank, they shouldn't be focused on things like gender and climate. They should be focused on their original purpose of financial stability. But they're using these things, climate, gender, equality, to implement all of these things and take our wealth. I can guarantee you that this is the case. And when people think that the Great Reset is tinfoil hat theory, no. All of these organizations have worked very closely together for a few decades now to build this system. And World Economic Forum, in short, they had this paper, June 30th, 2020, Sustainable Development on their site. Now is the time for a great reset. In short, we need a great reset of capitalism. And then on their Twitter account in 2018, they posted these 8 predictions for the world in 2030. Don't know if they still left it up because I know they have a tendency to delete some of their posts, but I took screenshots on their Twitter account. You'll own nothing and you'll be happy. And I was thinking, well, I really don't own a lot like I used to. I used to have all my books and things like that, records, VHS tapes, things like that. But now everything is digital. And if they want to take it away because you're not doing certain things that they want, they will do so. You'll own nothing and supposedly you'll be happy. And another thing you can do is read on the Canadian government's website the Policy Horizons reports. They talk about this. They talk about us having to kind of have this new psychology, new way to think about things. It's not about wealth. It's not about what you own, find pleasure in other things in life. And yeah, maybe there's some truth to that. But when you understand what they're going to take from you and what they mean by that, it's written on the government's website.
Oh, they have made
But
it
one of
very
the things,
clear. 3 pieces of clothing a year. You will travel
yes.
once every 2 years, domestic. This is complete and total control over your every movement, over your life. Smart cities. They will monitor how much energy you use, how far you're traveling. You will have an allotment for how much meat you can eat, an allotment for how much gasoline you can use. This is complete and total control over your life. And people have thought this was a conspiracy. And I mean, for anybody who still believes that, you're living in a cave. You must be, because you have to get out and take a look at what's truly going on. CRA has volunteered to do your taxes. So we won't even have to do this by force. People will volunteer because somehow this is convenient for them. Oh, the CRA is saving me, my H&R block, $150 fee to do my taxes for me. Of course, they're going to volunteer to do your taxes for you. But in order for them to do your taxes, you're going to have to disclose every last penny, down to the dime, down to the nickel, as to where this has gone. And already that's a problem. There's no privacy in Canada. I'm going to be doing a conversation here with John Carpe in the days and weeks to come about what's going on around privacy in Canada. I'm going to be talking to Lieutenant General Mazenoup, who did an amazing speech, which didn't go over very well, about, what's going on in Canada. This is not the same Canada that you and I grew up in. People have this myth and this belief still that, that the Canada of old somehow still exists, but it doesn't. It doesn't. We're living in I hate to use the term, but a brave new world, for lack of, a better way of describing it. And people need to become aware of what's going on. Mayor Amschel Rothschild, there's a name that, I know we haven't brought up today. We focus on the Rockefellers, but if you want to bring this further back, there's a name. He has been quoted as having said, "Let me issue and control a nation's money, and I care not who writes its laws." And we are seeing that statement played out to its fullest right now.
100%.
Gun
So I was
control.
away. Yeah, I was away this last weekend. I went to visit my daughter in Edmonton, and I got home and my Google Nest had automatically reset the temperature in my place to 13 and a half degrees. It was freezing in here. And I went on the app and tried to fix it so that wouldn't happen again. That I'd come home in winter, my place would be an ice box. But they ask for your address and they claim it's for tax information and stuff on that app. I don't need to give them that information. So it's just really upsetting. I read an article a while ago, a couple of years ago, about these Google Nest devices, things like that, that they'll be able to monitor everything. My Google app had my television connection to TELUS on there. So it's just really frightening how much control they already have that we're really not even aware of. But that post back on their Twitter account in 2018, to say at that point in time, the US won't be the world's leading superpower by 2030, that to me was quite a statement, because back in 2018, I really wouldn't have been talking like that a handful of countries will dominate and the US won't be in charge. But now, every day, it seems like we're getting closer to that being the case. And it's very frightening. I would rather have the US in charge. I know they don't always do the right thing, but I would take that, capitalist democracy any day over Chinese communism. So I think that's all that I was going to share with you today, Nadine, from my presentation. Like I said, I could go on for hours. Thank you for hosting me and for letting me get the word out.
Oh, you know what? When it's just to end here on, the warning signs and how they do put it out in front of you. Do you remember the HSBC ads in the airports?
No,
Remember
which
what?
ones?
Oh, HSBC used to have these ads, they had the B with the technology and they had the World's Bank. And literally, I remember the very first time I ever saw them walking through an airport, I looked at this and I went, oh my goodness, this is the one world order and they were the world's bank, and HSBC was caught as well back, I think, in the early 2008-ish kind of time frame, I do believe, or four, somewhere in there, that, with a big scandal again on money laundering, cartel money. Now you have, you know, uh, another bank, TD, who just got fined, right? These banks, and then, Sam Cooper has been amazing at exposing so much of what's going on with the underground banking and how they've been, money laundering for years and decades. And again, it's China, right? That's
Mhm.
and money is what makes the world go around. The cartels. We just had, the large cartel leader in Mexico who was killed. But they can only do what they do because they have amassed huge amounts of money to employ people, to bribe people. You take the money away and you take their power away. And I think really that's what Trump is trying to accomplish. And so many people in Canada that are just so anti-Trump and anti-American, they're failing to see, the facts, and they're failing to see what's actually going on, as opposed to, okay, remove the emotion here, just look. And there are so many dots to connect, of which you've connected only some of them today. As you pointed out, we could go on for a day like this and still just be, brushing the surface. So, thank you so much. I know you're a little hesitant to name names and connect some of these dots, but I think it's so important for people to understand today, because we are running out of time, and it takes a lot of courage. So God bless you for doing that, because and you bring receipts. That's what I loved about you. When I had a friend, we have a mutual friend, who's like, you need to get in touch with Jennifer and watch one of her presentations. I was like, good Lord, I love this woman.
Thank you. No, I often, I'll listen to some of these YouTube conversations with people talking about some of these things. And that's what I find frustrating is, sure, it's an interesting conversation, but I do want to see the facts, because otherwise people will just think it's a conspiracy theory. So I hope people were able to see that today. And I encourage everybody, go to the government's website, see how many of your taxpayer dollars are going to the IMF, where that money is going, and if it's really being used for what they say, because I honestly don't think it is. And what's the red line for people? How many billions of your taxpayer dollars have to go into a black hole before you care? Because we're going to be broke as a country very soon, and a lot of danger.
Yeah, and for me, it's not even about the money. It's the loss of my freedom, and it's not even about my freedom. It's about that of my daughter.
Yeah.
My dad always taught me you leave things better than you find it, and we are certainly not doing that. And for them, they won't even know what they've lost. I think back in the '70s and the '80s and how much freedom I enjoyed. You're probably a little younger than me, but boy, no, you're right there
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
Right. And
Yeah.
then, so to see, what we're doing to our children, the disservice, by just trying to, ignore the problem, and or band-aid the problem in some way. We need to tackle this head on. So thank you so very much, Jennifer. And again, just remind people where they can find you and more information, your newsletter.
Thank you. So Sandpiper Trading Corporation.com. And I do have a monthly newsletter. I write about some of these things that if people are interested, they can subscribe. And I'm always open to chat on Twitter. It's Jen Still Many Dots. Jenny Many Dots is my handle on Twitter. And this is just for me a moral imperative to talk to people about this and get the word out that people see what's going on. So anytime, reach out to me on my website or Twitter, and I love to chat. Thank you.
Well, there you have it, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that episode. Please do leave us your comments. Please do please do share. If we cannot get this message beyond our own, little audience, then realistically, we're not really making an impact. Everybody needs to know what's going on, and so many people miss the financial part of the problems. I know it's easy to point the finger at a politician, but there's money moving the chessboard, and the politicians, in some cases, some of them are just pawns on the board being used and manipulated. So it's very important that the bigger picture is shared. And I really want to thank Jennifer today for coming on to share her message and the research that she's done. And I will say this, if the United States sneezes, Canada catches a cold. We are very much interconnected, and as much as people may dislike Trump, Trump is temporary. Our relationship with the United States is very long term, and decoupling from that relationship is probably not the wisest thing for Canada to be doing. Driving a wedge between Canada and the United States right now, again, not probably the wisest thing to be doing. So, again, we need to remove the emotion and just really focus in on the facts, understand what's truly going on, and to whose benefit and to whose dismay. Like I said, with money, money doesn't disappear, it just changes hands. Right? It's like energy, it cannot be destroyed. So if you're losing something, who's gaining? Every dollar in inflation, right, is costing you more, but somebody's benefiting from that on the other side. And I will tell you right now, it's the government. So when they say they don't want inflation, sure, they don't want too much inflation that you get upset that may cost them an election, but inflation is a benefit to governments everywhere. So on that note, I'm just going to leave it there. May you please do please do share, please do leave us your comments, and God bless you all.